All right, this is going to be a quick review of development. Keep in mind this is a huge unit with lots of theories and theorists, so it's going to be important for you guys to take time to look over those charts so that you have kind of that added information, because this will just kind of scratch the surface. All right, remember that there are three big issues in developmental psychology. They include nature versus nurture, continuity versus stages. So remember, they're looking at is development gradual and continuous? Here I say like riding an escalator. In class I talked about the growth of a tree. Or does it proceed through a sequence of separate stages? Here I talk about climbing a staircase, but remember I talked about the progress from into a butterfly. And then stability versus change. Those are the three big issues. Next, we're going to look at concerns during prenatal development. So we have the germinal stage, which is conception to 2 weeks, embryonic, which is 3 to 8 weeks, and fetal stage, which is 9 weeks to birth. Couple key terms here. So we have zygote, embryo, fetus, neonate, teratogens, and fetal alcohol syndrome. Remember that when I showed you these slides, I had mentioned you learned a lot of this in biology, but we looked at different things like when the heart begins to beat, which is during that second stage, during that embryonic stage. So we looked at that. We had talked about different teratogens, which are just things that can be harmful to the fetus. Keep in mind that that can be anything that the mother eats or ingests into her body, but also that sperm can be affected by drugs and things like that as well. We move from that into infancy and childhood. Remember that newborn reflexes are those things that they're born being able to do. So those include sucking, grasping, Moro, Babinski, and rooting. Rooting is probably the one you're most likely to see. The newborn senses, remember that they are able to do all of these things when they're born, but sight is probably the one that is not the greatest. They're born almost legally blind, and they can see about a foot away from their face. Motor development, remember that typically that's due to maturation. So it typically develops in the same order, which I've listed here. So standing around 8 to 9 months and then walking about 15 months. And then remember, maturation is that key term that talks about the biological growth processes. So it's the biology of development. After infancy and childhood is where we start to move into bigger areas of development, so cognitive development in general. Remember that our key theorist here is going to be Jean Piaget. His research is based on schemas, assimilation, and accommodation. Remember, he talked about how children are kind of like these active thinkers, and they're constantly trying to understand the world. They use schemas in order to do that, so they create concepts or frameworks that they can then fit everything into. Assimilation is when you interpret experiences in light of what you already know. So you interpret it based on your schema. So let's say that you have a schema that includes dogs or something like that, and dogs would be four-legged animals with tails. And then you see a horse and you call it a dog. Well, you assimilated. You were trying to understand something new in light of only what you knew. When you have to change, when you have to make an accommodation to a schema, then that's called accommodation. So that's where you make a change. You either modify your schema or you create an entirely new schema. So that's kind of the process in general of cognitive development. Piaget said that we develop through a series of stages. They include sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. So just to kind of highlight what some of those are, remember that sensory motor, some of the key phenomena there are going to be object permanence and stranger anxiety. Stranger anxiety comes about 8 months, and it can last up to 2 years. And that's where, because you don't have maybe the ability to assimilate new faces into your current schema, you tend to get really scared around new people. I use the example of the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus in class. And then object permanence is something that you don't have at the beginning of the sensory motor stage, but that you would develop as you progress through that stage. And object permanence is the understanding that things exist even though they're out of sight. So we talked about peekaboo, and we talked about hiding things under a blanket. The pre-operational stage then, this is where we can represent things with words and images, but we do not have logical reasoning at this stage. Things that would come into play here, well, there's actually quite a few things. Remember, you're not capable of conservation at this stage, which I'll talk about in the next one. Egocentrism is something that comes about, and that's the inability to take someone else's perspective. We also talked about centration, which is focusing on one aspect of a problem and not really being able to notice any other aspects. We talked about irreversibility, so not being able to reverse operations at this stage as well. Concrete operational, then, you're able to think logically, but only about concrete events. And then conservation, you become capable of conservation at this stage. For conservation, we talked about lots of different things. So pouring water from a short, wide glass into a tall, skinny glass and knowing that it's the same amount of water. Or we looked at quarters being spread out and knowing that there's 5 of each, but because they're spread out, you may not or you may say that there's more in that row. Conservation is where you grasp those concepts. You're also able to do mathematical transformations, adding, subtracting, dividing, multiplying, things like that. And then formal operational, the real key here would be abstract reasoning. So you can think abstractly and hypothetically about different things. So all the general ages are listed here as well. Theory of mind, I listed under the pre-operational stage. Remember that wasn't necessarily a Piaget thing, but that's where this would fit in. And I would take you back to that Sally and Anne ball in a cupboard thing that your book talked about. Probably don't have to know that study, but it is an example of theory of mind. As we continue then through development, we look at social development. A key in social development would be our attachment research. Attachment is the emotional tie that you gain with another person. And we know that children are looking for that closeness with their caregiver. We have a few key theorists here. We learned about Konrad Lorenz first. Remember, he was the one that had that very close relationship with geese. And he learned about imprinting and critical periods, although we know that there's no critical period for human attachment. Then we learned about the Harlows, and the Harlows were that study out of UW-Madison where they did the study with the monkeys and they had the cloth mother and the wire mother, and they found that body contact was way more important for the formation of attachment than nourishment, than the mother who fed the baby. And then finally, we looked at Mary Ainsworth, and she had created that strange situation experiment where she left the mother and child alone in a room. A stranger came in, the mom returned, and then she was paying attention to the reunion. How easy was it for the mom to calm the child down? From that, she created attachment styles. Secure attachment style, which in that study, the majority of babies were. That meant that she was able to calm them down when she returned. Anxious, ambivalent. Actually, these look like they're listed incorrectly on your notes here. Anxious ambivalent is what that next one should say, which is an insecure attachment style. And in that one, when the mother returned, the baby was upset, but she also struggled to calm the baby down. And then the final one should be avoidant, which is another type of insecure attachment. And with that, the baby wasn't really upset when the mother left, and the baby didn't really care when the mother returned. Keep in mind that temperament could play in with this as well. Temperament is largely biological in nature. The majority of kids are easy. About 15% are slow to warm up. And then about 10% of children are difficult. And all of those things can influence attachment. After that, we looked at parenting with Diana Baumrind. Remember, authoritarian, authoritative, permissive. Were kind of the 3 key ones. And then there was even the uninvolved style, which you're less likely to see. So remember, authoritarian would be that there are rules. It's kind of like a dictatorship. You have to follow those rules. You don't really have a strong say in anything. And the impact there is that you may struggle with social skills and you may lack self-esteem. Permissive parents, I usually use the example of the mom in Mean Girls. They care a little bit more about being a friend than maybe being a parent. So usually children are spoiled. There's not a lot of punishment or expectations. The impact is that kids tend to be more aggressive and likely more immature. And then authoritative. would be parents who are demanding and responsive. What that means is that they have rules, but again, you have a say in that, and they usually release responsibility the older or more mature that you might get. The likely impact is that you would have higher self-esteem, you're able to rely on yourself more, and you have social competence. Gender, we didn't really talk a lot about in class, you guys just read about, but obviously gender is a big part of our society and of our own self-concept. So just paying attention to some of these key words will be important as well. Gender identity is your sense of being male or female. Gender roles would be the expectations about the way that men and women should behave. So sort of like the actions that society says are okay for men and women. Gender typing is how we acquire traditional masculine or feminine roles. And then social learning theory says that we learn by observing and imitating, and also through reward and punishment. So think about how that would influence all of these things. So your gender identity, your gender roles, and gender typing as well. Adolescence, we talked a lot about that. Just keep in mind key things even from like biology class: puberty, primary sex characteristics, secondary sex characteristics, okay? Moral development, we focused on Kohlberg as our main researcher here. He divides moral development into 3 levels, but 6 stages. Pre-conventional morality is looking at self-interest. So children obey to either avoid punishment or to obtain rewards. Conventional morality is early adolescence. And this is where we uphold laws and social rules simply because they're laws and rules. We typically do things to try to gain social approval or avoid disapproval. And then post-conventional morality is the last of the stages. And that's where we have affirmation of people's agreed upon rights, or we follow what we might perceive as basic ethical principles. It says morality of social rules is weighed, but not blindly accepted. What this means is you're not just going to follow along with rules or laws because of that. Instead, you might believe that there are higher ethical or moral reasons to do things. So you might go against society's rules because you believe it's in the best interest of others. You also aren't really putting your own personal interest into this at all. So really thinking through it, try to think about the examples that we used in class. So pre-conventional morality might be whether or not to steal a cookie. Conventional morality might be whether or not to speed or to cyberbully or something like that. And post-conventional morality might be something bigger, like a concept related to abortion laws or gay marriage laws or something like that. All right, for social development, we have Erik Erikson. Remember, you're probably going to want to look at your handout that I gave you. I gave you lots of handouts for this. But keep in mind, Erikson said that socially we develop through a series of stages. All of them are tied to a general age. And as you go through them, remember that the words you're seeing on the sheet, that's the end result of the stage, which then influences your development. So for example, from birth until about a year and a half, your biggest thing is you have to rely on others for a bottle or to get your diaper changed or things like that. If you kind of like navigate and negotiate those challenges well, then you tend to develop trust in others, okay? Like a trusting personality, and that your needs will be met when you need them met. However, if you don't have the food that you need, if you're crying and you're wet and your diaper's not getting changed, you might develop a sense of mistrust in others, okay? Autonomy versus shame and doubt. Remember, I call this the I can do it myself stage, and typically we're looking at potty training, how well that goes. You might develop a sense of I can do this, or you might develop a sense of feeling like you don't really have the capability of doing things, and therefore a personality where you doubt your own capabilities. Initiative versus guilt. I call this the why stage. This is where kids ask a lot of questions and they go out and they want to explore and they're really inquisitive. But if we shut that down, if we're yelling at them, stop asking questions, I don't know why, things like that, then they might develop a sense of guilt and they might not be as vocal about asking questions and wanting to explore. The next one is industry versus inferiority. I talk about this as being kind of that first time around the age of 6 that you're headed out to school. Remember, up until this time, everybody tells you how great you are. But once you head off to school, you're really comparing yourself against others for the first time. And if you're looking around and you feel like you're not doing well, you're terrible at math, you're not a good artist, whatever else it might be, then you might develop a sense of inferiority as you compare yourself to others. However, if you're doing okay and if you're encouraged by teachers, other students, parents, things like that, then you'll develop a sense of competence in yourself. As we move into adolescence, it's looking at identity versus role confusion. Remember, your biggest job is to figure out who you are by the end of adolescence. Intimacy versus isolation, that's age 20 to 40. So that might be like the stage that your parents are in or something like that. And their biggest goal is to surround themselves with people who are loving, trusting, caring, all of those things. So whether that's in a relationship or in friendships, your goal is to surround yourself with those people. If you do, you'll develop a sense of intimacy, which is just like an emotional closeness. And if you don't, a sense of isolation. The next stage is middle adulthood. So that's age 40 to 60. And that's generativity versus stagnation. Your biggest challenge here is to make sure that you feel like you're contributing to society. Sometimes people do that through having children. Other times people do that because they've chosen a job where they're able to give back. Other times it might be through volunteer service or church or things like that. So if as you go through this stage near the end of it, you feel like, yeah, I'm definitely contributing to society and you feel like you're part of something bigger, then you develop a sense of generativity. However, if you're finding that you're very self-focused, then you would develop that sense of stagnation. And then finally, in late adulthood, we look at integrity versus despair. And really during this stage, you're looking back on your life and trying to evaluate sort of like, did I do it right? Did I live it okay? Did I do the things that I wanted to do as you reflect back? And if so, then you'll age with integrity. And if not, you'll age with despair. Key points related to adulthood and aging. Remember that there are some physical changes that happen. So strength, reaction time, cardiac output, those gradually decrease. Keep in mind that while we talk about Alzheimer's here, Alzheimer's is not something that happens to the majority of people. So it's not a normal part of aging. Some sensory abilities will gradually decrease. For example, vision, you need more light, smell, and hearing. Those would all be examples. In terms of cognitive development and aging, it's important to differentiate between crystallized and fluid intelligence. Remember that crystallized intelligence is like an encyclopedia or like Wikipedia to you guys, I suppose. It's all of your accumulated knowledge, and that tends to increase with age because you've been around a lot longer, you know a lot more. But fluid intelligence is your ability to reason quickly and abstractly, and that tends to decrease with age. So it might take people more time to sift through all the things that they have to sift through, okay? And then when we talk about death and dying, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she had identified the 5 stages that terminally ill people may pass through. They're denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Lots of important people in our development unit, so just make sure that you take time to look through some of those charts and things like that that we handed out so that you know all of the people and in general their studies.